Hey class, in this video we're going to be adding UI metrics into our Godot project. So that'll basically show things like the number of items the player has or points, as well as how many lives the player has left, anything else that you want to display to the player as they're playing the game. And so we'll go over how to create the scene and set things up. There's some scripts that we'll just be adding into it. So we're not going to be writing any code, but we will be adding some scripts, adding some animations, and adding a few things into our UI. And we'll go over how the different scripts work. So you could use them for different types of metrics. You could add beyond the basic metrics that I've covered in these videos. So let's get started. So to get started, we can use the designer default folder, or you can work on a project that you've been working on this semester. We actually have a metrics scene in the folder. We're just going to delete that and rebuild it from scratch. So I'm going to open up MMP 270. Again, if you have a game, just go and work in there. If you need to grab stuff from the designer folder, you can do that. I'm going to go over to the designer folder and go to the design default. And one thing that I want to do before I get started is I'm going to be using a font in my project, a custom font. And so I have a font that I have here. It's the kind of pixel font that I use for a lot of stuff. And you can see I've also got some information here. This is an attribution from the developer. So notice that in the attribution, it says freeware. And so I can use the font however I want to for my project. And I actually found this font using a website called dafont.com, which is a good place to get Creative Commons and open license fonts. Probably went to Pixel, something like that. I'm not exactly sure how I found it, but it is called 04B03. Let's see if we can find it that way. Okay, so you can see it here. And if I click on the link here, it'll take me to the creator of the fonts page. And they actually have a lot of cool stuff on here. They have a whole bunch of different fonts on here. So these fonts would be useful for a game. You could look for other style font. You don't have to use a pixel style font on dafont.com. You could use Google Fonts, but anything that has a TTF file, you will be able to use in Godot. So I'm going to go over how to do that in this lab when we get to our item. So if you didn't have the font file or you wanted to get another font file, you would just find the font that you want and click download and make sure it's a true type font. So this one that I just got, this is actually an SIT font. That might work, but if I go to the Windows version, that gives me a true type font. And so that's the one that I'll probably want to use. But as long as you have a true type font, you should be able to use it in Godot. So you may not need a font, but I'm going to use that in the label section when we do counting our items. You may also need some art for this lab. So I'm going to have my Apple animation as representing my items. You might have coins or something like that. I'm also going to have hearts to represent how many lives I have. So there are some defaults if you want to use those, but if you created your own, you'll probably find those in the reward section. So I'm going to use this Apple idle and this reward life, and I'll actually use the animation in my metrics scene. So make sure that you have all of the art you want to use for your icons as well. So let's go back to designer, and I'm going to go to project.godot. I'm going to close this scene and go to my scenes folder. So you can see I already have a metrics scene in here. I use that because you need to use it in other parts of the labs, but we're going to build this from scratch. So you can start just by deleting this, and we still have all the scripts and everything that we need. And you can see that it's in some other scenes as well, but we'll just add it back in once we create it. So I'm just going to remove that. And so now we can start from scratch. So what I want to do is go to scenes and create a new scene. And I'm going to call this metrics, of course. And what I want to use here is one of the green user interface nodes. And that's going to give me this control node. And I'm just going to rename this metrics. So that's what will show up when I put it back into one of my scenes. And you can see with the UI node, we get this layout. So we want to make sure to use the full rectangle, and we're going to lay things out. So this is going to be a little bit different than our start menu layout, where we wanted to kind of center things and have things in the middle. We're going to put all of our metrics in the top left corner. So depending on what type of game you're making, you may want your metrics to appear in different places. A lot of games have the metrics at the bottom or the right corner. It doesn't matter exactly where they go as long as they match what's going on in your game. So I'm just going to use the left corner as a default. So I'm going to kind of zoom in here a little bit and then get started. So the first thing I want to do is add a couple of icons so the player knows what they're looking at. So I'm going to go to metrics. I'm going to go to add child node. And for my icons, I'm going to use an animated sprite. You could use a regular sprite if your icon doesn't have an animation, but my icon already has an animation. So I'm just going to use an animated sprite. And I'm going to start by calling this my item. And so this represents the item. I have the Apple animation that I use for that. But if you have coins or something else that you can collect, obviously that would go there. So I'm going to add in my animation. So I'll go over to frames and go to new sprite frames and then click on new sprite frames. And we only need one animation here, so it's fine if it's called default. If you want to rename this to idle to match our other animations, you can do that. And then to add in my animations, I'm going to go to the add frames, the little waffle button, and go to sprites. And I just want to find my Apple reward, and I'm just going to use the idle animation. So I'm going to click open. This has 2 columns and 2 rows, so I'll select those frames and add in the frames. And that's pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to drag this down to kind of where I want it to appear in my layout. So if I look at the full metric scene and then look at the item, and if I want, I can also turn the grid on so I can snap the item into place, or I can change my grid setting. So if I want larger steps, I can do 16 by 16. And so that looks pretty good. I might put my item right here just so there's a little bit of a margin. And so I think that will look good. We can take a look when we put it into our scene later. So this apple is going to be playing. We can turn on playing. So basically that apple will just be there so we can see that it matches the apples that we collect in the scene, but it's not going to move. It's just an icon to represent that that's what we're collecting. And it might be too big. We could make it smaller if we want to, but I think that'll be fine. The next icon that we're going to use is our lives. So we can show the player how many lives they have left. So I'm going to add another animated sprite for that. And I'm going to call this life. And then I'm going to go to my sprite frames and click sprites, and I'll rename this idle again. You can really leave that as default. It doesn't matter that much because we're not going to change that animation, but I like it to match my other animations. And I'm going to click on my waffle, and I'll go to my reward life and click open. And this one only has 3 frames, but it's the same 2 columns and 2 rows. So I'll select those and click add 3 frames. And let's turn playing on. And so now we can see our life and our apple. And I'm going to move this a little bit over because we are going to have a counter in the middle. And so we're going to look at 2 different types of metrics. So one with the apple, we can go up. So we don't want to keep adding apples because we could go up to like 100 or something like that. That would be too many apples. So for that one, I'm just going to use a number, and I'm just going to increase the number or decrease the number depending on whether we collect apples or not. For the life metric, I'm going to have a certain number of lives that will decrease if we get hit by an obstacle. And so I know how many lives are sort of the maximum number of lives. And so I'm going to just duplicate my life to show that. So I'm going to actually rename this to be life 1. And then I'm just going to duplicate this 2 more times and spread these out in my layout. So this is life 3. I'll actually move this over, and that's life 2. So now I have my basic setup with the metrics, and now I want to add in my counter here. Okay, so the next thing that we want to add is a label. And a label is a UI node that we can put some text in, and we can update that text using our code. So I'm going to go to metrics and add a child node, and I'll look for label. And I will create the label, and I'm just going to move this next to item since it's associated with it. And I'm going to rename this label item count. And let's move the label, oops, here. And I'll kind of make it take up the same box. It's a little tricky with this UI stuff, but I'm just going to anchor it right there and just make it take up the same amount of space. And for our text, let's start with 0. So we're going to have 0 apples when we begin our scene. So the first thing that I want to do is create my font. So I'm going to go down into my control node for the label and go to custom fonts and click on font and go to new dynamic font and then click on that. And that will create the new dynamic font for me. And then I'll go to font, click on new dynamic font data. So there's a couple steps here. And then I have to click on that. And what I'm going to want to do here is find my font path. So I'll go to fonts and get the font TTF file that I want to load and click open. And now I'm going to have to, I can't see it right now. It's a little buggy. So what I'm going to do is go to the font settings and just change the size real quick. And so that's going to bring it back. And so we want to change the size anyway. So one thing that I'm going to want to change is I don't want anti-aliasing. It is a pixel font, so I don't want the anti-aliasing, which is what's going to make sort of blurred lines when it's trying to interpolate between the pixel data. So I'm going to turn that off. And now you can see that the font quality changes when I set the size. And so now I'm going to increase the size here. I don't want it to be too big. I want it to be maybe about as big as the apple. So I'll increase it to 40. I think that looks pretty good. And I may want to center it a little bit so I can go to the extra spacing and I can move it down a little bit. That actually looks pretty good. That looks kind of lined up. Although it is actually more space above than below. So I guess it depends if I'm looking on the apple or the other parts, but that actually looks pretty good. I can also add an outline color. The outline might be useful if there's a lot going on in my scene to make sure that the graphic stands out. I don't think I actually really need it, but it is a good option if you want to use it. So I think that looks pretty good. I might want to move it over. And so I actually may want to change the snapping again. So I can configure the snap again and make it smaller. And now I have a little bit more options, so I can kind of move it over. And so you can play around with it until you get something that you like. You might want to zoom out a little bit and see how that looks. So let's actually move this over a little bit. And then maybe we can move the lifes over. So let's move those over a bit. So I think that looks pretty good. You could play around with the layout until you get something that you like. I can also change the color of the font in custom colors. So I could go to font color and maybe I can match the main color of my apple. There's a lot of other things that I can do here. If I was doing a more sort of robust UI, there's a lot of options, like I can create a theme and then apply the theme to different components. But I really just have this one element, which is the item count. So that looks pretty good. I've got all of my elements set up. So now let's go ahead and add in our script. So the first script, we're going to go to the metrics and go to script. And we're going to put here the metrics manager. So the metrics manager is going to kind of manage all of the metrics in the scene. So I'm going to click open. And then if we click on that and look at the script variables, you can see there's a metrics paths with an array. And what this does is it helps the metrics manager keep track of all of the different elements inside the metrics. And so anything that's going to need to be updated by our scene should go in that metrics paths. And so we have the item count, which will be updated. And then each one of these life icons could be shown or disappear. The apple icon isn't going to change, so we don't have to add that one in. So we can go back to our metrics and go to metrics paths. And this is an array, so it's just a list of objects that we can use. So I'm just going to increase the size to 4, and then I'm going to assign these. So I'm going to assign the item count. And so you can see it just gives us a reference to where that item count is. And then I'm going to get the life number 1, get the life number 2, and get the life number 3. And so that looks pretty good. Let's take a look at that script for a second, just so we can see what it does. So it's actually pretty simple. So it's just going to get the metrics paths. And then when the scene starts, it's going to go through each one of those metrics paths and put it into a node list. And then it has an update display function that's going to be called by the scene manager. And what the update display does is it goes through each one of our metrics, and it's going to call a function called update display, which is actually going to be in the script that we add to each one. So the advantage of doing it this way is we can add lots of new metrics without really changing our code much. The disadvantage is that we have to add a bunch of different scripts. So we have a lot of components, so we can do a lot of different things. We have a lot of variability with those components, but we do have to add a bunch of scripts in and make sure everything is connected correctly. So I'm going to close everything except for the metrics manager to simplify this a bit. And so let's add in our other scripts. So we start with the item count. So I'm going to collapse these font settings and scroll to the bottom where we see the script. And I'm going to go to load and go into scripts. And so this one is a metrics count. So it's just a number. It's typically going to start at 0, but it could start at other numbers, and we just are going to count up. So I'm going to open that up. And if we click at that on that script, you can see there's a name, and the name should match the name that we use in the global variables. So see, we have a reference to the global variables here, and we have this item count as the default. So let's actually open our global variables script. So remember, we have lives and item count. And so in our MetricsCount, we have the default item count, but you could change this if you have other types of items that you want to track. And then it's going to update the display as soon as the program starts. And so that will change the item count. So even if we set our default text to like 10 or like a word, it would actually set it to the real item count as soon as we start the scene, as long as we have this script attached. And then here's our update display function, which again is what gets called when we do metric.updateDisplay. And all that does is it sets our text to the global item name, and then it converts it into a string so that it works with our text. And so in our item name for the script variables, if you had more than one item or you had a different name in your global variables, you would have to change this here. But that actually matches what we have in the global variables, so we can leave that as is. Next, we have a script for the life. And so I can go to script, I can go to load and go to scripts. And here we have the MetricToggle. So this is just something that's going to be on or off. And so I have scripts that handle these two basic needs with our metrics. If you have other things that you want to do that may not work with one of these scripts, let me know and we can come up with a way to figure that out. So I'm going to click open, and now I'm going to go to the script, and notice that this one has a metric name. So again, this name should match what we have in our global variables, which it does. It's the player lives variables, which is what is going to change if our player gets hurt or hit by an obstacle. And then we want the value that we're going to compare it to. And essentially, we're just going to say, is this value still valid? So if the global lives is 1 or greater, then that means it's true. And so in our update display function here, we're just setting the visibility. So the visibility is true if our global metric is greater than or equal to our value. And if not, it's false. So this is pretty specific to showing a certain number of lives, but you might have other items that you would want to show like this. So you could use it in other instances. And there's other ways that you could set it up that we could do in the code if this doesn't work exactly for what you want to do. So we do have to add one of these scripts to each one of our lives. And there's also going to be some script variables, the metric name. So player lives we can leave because that's what we're looking for. And then the value. So for our first life, that should be 1. And then for our second life, let's add the script again. And one thing that you can do so you don't have to add the script 3 times is add the script first and then duplicate it. But since I've already done my layout, I'm just going to do it this way. So I'm going to go to MetricToggle, click open. And this is the second life, so I'm just going to increase that value to 2. So this life will only display if there are 2 or more player lives. And then for life 3, we're going to do the same thing. So we'll go to scripts, go to MetricToggle. And this is our third life, so we'll do 3. And that's actually it. That's our basic setup for our metrics. So let's test that out. We're going to go to our scenes and let's open a scene. So I'll open level 1. And there's our player. This is left off from where I was using this in one of the level design labs. My player's at the end of the level because I was working on one of the level design labs, but there's some apples and some hearts. So that's all we really need to work on this. If we scroll out though and go back to our origin, that's where we're actually going to see our metrics. And you can actually see the metrics that we created right here because we already had the metrics in the scene. But let's say that we didn't. So I'm just going to remove this real quick. So how do we add the metrics into the scene? First, we go to our UI section and we're going to add a instance and type in metrics. And there we go. There's our metrics right there. And if we click on that scene, it'll bring us back to the metrics here. So then if we go to the label, we want to look at this array and we can see it has everything that we need in there. That's the default because it's actually what is in the scene. So we want to leave that. But let's say by mistake you made the size too small, then you can just hit refresh and it'll go back to how it is in the original scene. Or if you make the size too large, that's going to create an error because it's going to try to update a metric that's not there. You can just refresh that again. So there's no real reason that you should be editing that, but just in case something happens, you can just hit the refresh button and it'll go back to the state that you created it in. Another thing that you're going to want to do is put the metrics below your other UI scenes. Depending on how you have this set up, if I get a game over, I won't be able to click on the start over button if the metrics scene is on top of it. So just be careful for that. So the only thing that we have to do now to make sure that the metrics work is go to our scene manager, and you can see there's a metrics UI path in the script variables. You just have to click assign and go to metrics and go to OK. And the reason we have to do this is the scene manager is what's going to actually tell our metrics to update. So if we look at the scene manager script, you can see when we get hit, we see metrics.update display. If we get an item, we get metrics.update display. So our scene manager knows when certain things happen in the game, and it can then tell our metrics to update based on those events. So let's go in and see if this actually works. Just as a test, I'm going to hit play, and we should see our metrics update if I get a apple. So we can see the label for the apple went from 0 to 1. And since we're here, let's take a screenshot of that. And then if I hit the vines, you can see I lose a life. And so let's take a screenshot of that as well. And then I think there's a life somewhere around here. So let's see if I can get a life to see that we get that life back. Okay, this actually might be kind of difficult. Okay, I did a game over. So let's start over. Let's go this way and see if I can get a life back. Or maybe I'll just move my character. So let's just move my character over here. Actually, let's just go down here, and I'll pretty easily be able to lose a life and then get a life back. So we just have to get hit by the snake. So we lost a life. And now if we pick up this life, now we can see we got a life back. So we can see our metrics are responding to what's happening in the scene. And that's basically what we want for this to work. So we have some screenshots, so we can add that to the Open Lab, and that's everything that we actually need to do for our metrics lab. So keep in mind that these are just a few examples that go along with the game that I'm working on. If you have other ideas for things that you want to show in your display, in your UI, in the game, let's talk about what you could do if the scripts that we already have would work for that, or if we would need to add another script, if there's some other type of icon or something like that. Because there's a lot of other Godot UI systems that we haven't really looked into. These are just a couple basic things that we can do to display to the player the score and how many lives they have left and these other basic things about the game that they need to know. So I'm done in Godot. I'm going to exit. So let's go to the Open Lab. I'm going to create a new post, and I'll choose the category metrics from the designer tier, and let's add in my metrics. And so we can say I added a counter for my items and 3 life icons. And then we can just add in a couple of screenshots to just show our metrics in action. And so that looks pretty good. We can preview that. All right, so that looks pretty good. We can see the metrics in these screenshots. And so that shows what we want to show. So let's go ahead and publish.